Hi, good morning, everyone in South Africa, and good evening, and hello to everybody around the world in different time zone. Thank you for joining the Good Governance Academy. If you don't know about the Good Governance Academy, we, as a public, in the public interest, we host webinars and events that bring thought leadership to people around the world, to leaders, to educators, etc. And today is no difference, except we're focusing on a very important process for South Africa. Whoops, sorry. For South Africa. And that is the new King Report. And the King Reports, and Professor Mervyn King is here with us today and carries his name, is very, very important for not only corporate South Africa, but for all organizations in South Africa. And since 2008, we've had that very open opening up beyond companies into all sizes and types of organizations in South Africa. And we know that the King reports haven't only been adopted in South Africa, it's largely been adopted in many countries in Africa and around the world, with the national health system in the UK having adopted the King principles as well. Namibia having adopted King 3. So welcome everybody. The captions are on, so if you want to keep a transcript of this open forum, you're welcome to. We will be making the recording available on the event page, so you can go back to the event page. We will also be summarizing this in a podcast style. Our last colloquium, we summarized from 3 hours down to 20 minutes. So you can have a listen to the podcast style of the highlights. We also use AI to give us questions and answers, so the topical matters that were discussed. So you don't have to record it or have a transcript. We will make those available to you using the best available tools. And of course, we understand AI bias, so we will review and approve all of the transcripts, etc., all of the summarizations before we publish them on the event page, but all available on the event page. So we do have a Good Governance Academy show on Spotify where we are busy loading our podcasts. So please go and have a listen to that when you are in the car on the way to work or in Cape Town stuck in traffic. So welcome everybody. That was the closed captions, the reactions. Thank you very much. People, I see we've got old hands at the Good Governance Academy events. So welcome to use your reactions. If you like something, if you don't like something, please let us know. The chat is mainly for getting to know each other, communicating with each other, sharing information, sharing perspectives. We don't record the chat, so you're welcome to say what you want to in the chat function. In the Q&A, that's where we have our questions and answers. So if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A function, because we will come back to them afterwards, and we will put them on the event page if we don't get to them as we're talking. So I'd like to welcome the panel today. Unfortunately, Professor Bob Garrett is suffering from a cold. He's going to try and join us a little bit later, but he has no voice. So he has given me a statement to read out. So I will try my best to read it out. I won't try Bob Garrett's voice, but I will try and I will read it out. And he will set our perspective from an international perspective of what is expected of governance codes in countries today. Myself, I'll introduce an overview of the King 5 draft, and we're very grateful to the IOD of South Africa, the Institute of Directors of South Africa, for maintaining these codes and for promoting them as vigorously as they do. So we're very appreciative of the work that they've done, and it is on a volunteer basis as a participation. So we are very grateful for the work that they are doing. Right, I'm just going to jump into Professor Garrett's statement here. Oh, right, and at that point, it decides to disappear from our, so let me just open it up again. So Prof. Garrett says his personal comments on King 5. He says, you'll be reading or hearing this if my voice has not recovered from the infection he has caught. First of all, congratulations on producing the King 5 code. I know the enormous amount of time and effort needed to achieve agreement between the large number of people involved. It is more remarkable to create a workable document that adds to the development of effective corporate governance at a time when the world seems intent on destroying it. So please take my remarks as seeking to be constructively critical, yet wholly supportive. He provides a context. For the last 3 years, I have been reflecting on my 4 decades in developing effective corporate governance, wondering why it has not been central to public debate on bonding fragmented societies and being asked by next generation directors how I can help them and their organizations cope with understanding their future legal and societal roles in an increasingly turbulent world. I was particularly taken by the statement by E.O. Wilson, which seemed to resonate with many of the next gens. That's his term for the next generation directors. And the statement is, we have entered the century with Neolithic values, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. He argues that we do not know our purpose and so are an increasing danger to our own existence. I feel that King 5 is a necessary, solid building block for creating a more positive future, but will not be sufficient in itself. His framework for reviewing King 5, he's saying, I'm happy to accept the early statement of the governance outcomes, ethical culture, performance culture, conformance culture, and legitimacy. But given the way political priorities are changing and fragmenting, I would have placed performance culture at the top of the list and argued that it is key to releasing the other 3 cultures. So putting performance above ethical, conformance, and legitimacy. Secondly, I found that most next generation directors are open to viewing the scope of effective corporate governance as way beyond its current limits of finance and compliance. They're open to that. Indeed, they see it as both necessary and a way of guaranteeing humanity's survival. It is becoming more of a generational course. It is seen as the antidote to the long-held stupidity of venerating the pursuit of shareholder value to the detriment of the law and societal needs. They do see the need for more integrated thinking, way beyond previously accepted business disciplines. This must now include anthropology, design, geography, and environmental sciences. I have proposed a simple axiom that enterprise plus environmental impact plus social impact plus accountability equals effective corporate governance. Enterprise plus environmental impact, social impact, and accountability equal effective corporate governance. This is being tested and seems to be accepted positively. The start of the board's decision-making process must be enterprise, delivering the organization's primary purpose, regardless of whether it's for-profit or not-for-profit. Can King 5 be strengthened in this area? That's his question. I feel that a major strengthening could be put up front with the 7 duties of a company director and the purpose of a board as listed in the 2006 under the UK's Companies Act. A huge majority of directors, legislators, and regulators I've interviewed across 5 continents are ignorant or scared of public debate for fear of breaking the social science enveloping them. King 5 covers most of these and in some way, but isn't sufficiently explicit. And he just provides a reminder of section 171, listing the 7 duties of a director: to act within their powers or their constitution, to promote the success of their company, to exercise independent judgment, to exercise reasonable care, skill, and diligence, to avoid conflicts of interest, to declare interest in proposed transactions, and not to accept benefits from third parties. Section 172 lists the director's duties to promote the success of a company. A director must act in a way that he considers in good faith would be most likely to promote the success of the company for the benefit of its members as a whole, and in doing so have regard to the likely consequences of a decision in the long term, the interests of the company's employees, the need to foster the company's business relationships with suppliers, customers, and others, the impact of the company's operations on the community and the environment, the desirability of the company maintaining a reputation for high standards of business conduct, and the need to act fairly as between members of the company. Bob Garrett says, I argue that these 1.5 pages that I've just read should front any code and be committed to formally by all directors. They are not difficult to learn or to be a behavioral guide. Few directors, legislators, or regulators seem to use them. His fourth point is then, how then do we grow a rigorous developmental culture for registering directors? This must start with a sworn commitment by each director to follow the 7 duties and board purpose, followed by a guarantee that they will follow a 4-level board maturity process flowing from ignorance of corporate governance through to grumpy compliance, to becoming a member of a learning board, and then finally becoming a registered or recognized director. His fifth point, how can we change the regulator's role? I argue for a change away from the current mindset of the regulator as a football referee, blowing at an infringement and issuing a penalty, that of a rugby referee, running with the pack and issuing warnings, only then awarding a penalty. This would mean mainly real-time self-regulation and changes to the company secretarial and legal counsel roles to something more dynamic. So he's saying, so moving from a football referee blowing at an infringement and issuing a penalty to that of a rugby referee, which is running with the pack and issuing warnings, and only then awarding a penalty. So he's saying that this would mean a real-time self-regulation and changes to the company secretarial and the legal counsel roles to something more dynamic. And he argues much more helpful to boards. And we'll get to Arlene from the Internal Audit Institute of Internal Auditors of South Africa, and she can comment to us about that kind of assistance to the board. The sixth point of Professor Garrett, I argue that all of this will allow the public to be able to hold more easily boards to account, and therefore help start to rebond our society from the heart of our organizations. And he says, thank you very much for listening to his statement, and apologies again for not being able to voice it himself. So thank you very much. I'm sorry I wasn't a Professor Garrett myself, but I hope that came across clearly. I'd like to now ask Professor King just to give us an overview, having been involved in obviously starting the King reports, etc. But what is the purpose of King 5 in your mind, and why move from King 4 to King 5 when King 4 has such a tremendous international success?
Well, first of all, I'm Chair Emeritus of the King Committee, so I was not part of the King Committee and came to this conclusion. Secondly, Section 172 of the United Kingdom's Company Act, I was very involved with that. Because what happened in the United Kingdom is they thought that the question of the primacy of the shareholder was actually causing hardship on society and failing to degrade the planet. And so they came up with the theory of the enlightened shareholder approach. So from primacy shareholder to an enlightened shareholder. And if you look at Section 172, it says about the directors should make sure that the business of the company is successful for shareholders, but also for the stakeholders that goes on. And so at the ICAEE Institute of Chartered Accountants of England and Wales, of which I'm an honorary member, I have argued that this section has to be changed, and it is being changed, Karen. So when Bob, who I hope gets well soon, talks about it, the authorities in the UK are absolutely aware that it's not sufficient as to what has happened today. You've got to think of making business judgment calls in that triple context of the economy, society, and the environment. And in drafting that section, going back about 15 years ago, 20 years ago maybe, there was a sort of fog on the drafters with respect to fog, because the law was and is quite clear that the directors owe their duties of care, skill, diligence, loyalty, good faith to the company, and through the company to the various stakeholders. So for 150 years, you had this mistake which was made where directors actually reported to shareholders, as it were, instead of reporting to the company, through the company to all the stakeholders. So what has happened now is that King 4, as you said correctly, actually went around the world. King 3 introduced the concept of integrated thinking and integrated reporting. The reason for that was I was the chair of the United Nations on Governance and Oversight, and I had a meeting with IFAC, the International Federation of Accountants in Geneva. And at that meeting, we came to three very important conclusions. That this was at the beginning of the 21st century, that financial reporting was critical, but it was no longer sufficient to discharge the duty of accountability, because the research done on companies listed on the major stock exchanges of the world showed that only about, at that time, 20% of the makeup of the market cap was reflected in the financial statements. The rest was in the so-called, then called non-financial aspects, then ESG, etc. The result of that was we landed up in the alphabet soup. There were many organizations that started creating standards and then, as they were entitled to do, chose an audience. But that didn't stop the law. We, as directors, had to report to this incapacitated company to whom we owed our duty of care, etc., etc. So it was in King 3 that I had discussions with Accounting for Sustainability, which had been started by Prince Charles's Trust, now King Charles. And the discussions I had were with Sir Michael Peet of Peet Marwick fame, who was the private secretary to the king, to the then prince. He came to see me at my office in Amsterdam as chair of the Global Reporting Initiative. And we said, you know, operationally, companies operate on an integrated basis. You don't actually think of the financial issues and think separately in another silo of the sustainability issues. These things have got to be integrated. And so, King 3, there was the recommendation of integrated thinking and integrated reporting. And that started going around the world. And that was supported by, in England, and supported by the Prince Charles's Trust. And we formed the International Integrated Reporting Council. King 4 just took that further, and that really did go around the world. So I always use the example that there are very few organizations, so I use a very generic word, that today still think in silos. They think in this integrated manner. So integrated thinking, that Bastille has been stormed. The only debate now is if you report financially and you do sustainability report, whatever standard you do, because at the moment we're trying to align those standards. you do that report, then you're leaving it to the user to decide how the financial is impacting on the non-financial and vice versa. Whereas the board, which is the most informed body of persons in regard to what's happening in the company, should actually do an integrated report because they're thinking on an integrated basis. And my experience has been around the world that once a board decides to do an integrated report, then the integrated thinking just goes right through the company. So that's where we reached in King 4, 2016. And we thought that we had achieved this outcomes-based governance, and it wasn't necessary to do anything further. I then decided, having for 27 years been the chairman of the King Committee, that it was time to move on. And I resigned, and a new chair came into place, and I was appointed chair emeritus. But what caused King 5 to come out were the amendments to our Companies Act. So there were amendments to remuneration, etc., but none has yet come into effect. And then there was a realization that over the next 2 years at least, sustainability reporting, although in 2002, we recommended sustainability reporting in King 2, and that became a listing requirement. We were the first country in the world to do it. But over the next 2 years, the probability is huge that sustainability reporting will be mandated around the world in international trading. So we wanted to draw attention to that there was now sustainability reporting. I'm going to say the King Committee wanted to do that. And the King Committee also found that King 4, certainly to smaller organizations and SMEs, found it too voluminous. They tried to simplify it and cut it down. So they moved from 17 principles to 12, and also simplified the practices to achieve those aspirations of those principles. And then did a disclosure template. So it's apply and explain. It's still the regime, but the disclosure template is now there, in which you would put down your principle and assumption that you have run your business on that principle. But of course, the practices we recommend, the King Committee recommends international best practice under each principle. But of course, you can choose other practices to achieve that principle because your business is so different from what we think a business should be. And that's how King 5 came about. It was to simplify King 4 because SMEs and smaller companies were not following it as we thought they should. And I think the hiatus in King 5, which I want to discuss with the King Committee, is the following. That you've got companies listed on the stock exchanges of the world. So let's take a clothing manufacturing company listed on the London Stock Exchange. It buys its fabric in the main from a textile company in Mumbai, in the Far East. Mumbai has, over the years, supplied that fabric at the best price that the clothing manufacturer in London is able to source that fabric. And so they continue using them as a supplier. And of course, as the fabric supplier, they're the major supplier to this clothing manufacturer. But the question is that on the expenditure side, assuming that company is breaching humanitarian rights and is employing child labor, in order to reduce expenditure. When that is discovered, from experience, we know, and that becomes known, the holding company, which is listed on London Stock Exchange, the next morning could lose 50% of its market cap. So that SMEs are more and more practicing good governance, but you need that oversight of the customer to actually say, well, how are you carrying on business? You know, what is the quality of your governance? Because if it's discovered that, for example, they're using child labor to reduce expenditure, your market cap, your asset of the company, because you could use your shares to acquire something, for example, actually will drop by as much as 50%. And there have actually been cases like that. And I think that's something we've got to put into King 5, which is not there. So that's how it came about. Sorry, so I went a long way because you did introduce Section 172 of the UK as well. Right.
Thank you very much. That gives us a great understanding, and I know I've already had questions. We will we'll be able to put that out, what you've just said, into text so people can read it, because I think there's a lot, from what you're saying, there's a lot to interpret and to process from what you're saying. So thank you very much for that introduction. I'm just going to now take off my Good Governance Academy hat and put on my chair of the South African Bureau of Standards Technical Committee for the Governance of Organization. I'm also a co-editor, one of 5, of the ISO 37000 International Standard for the Governance of Organizations. What we have done is we've applied I also chaired, when we started the work on ISO 37000, I chaired the work on the environmental scan, and we'll do that as part of a process to revising the 37000, which will happen next year. And part of that process is this environmental scan. So we've taken the disciplines applied to looking at all of the codes from around the world and comparing them and analyzing what commonality and what differences are. So we've applied the same principles, and I'd like to share, I'm going to go into a bit of detail here, but this is, if you would like to participate, I will put up a poll later on if you would like to participate in providing comments. There's Prof. Garrett. Prof, I did read out your statement. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure, and I'm sorry I have such a croaky voice this morning.
Well, I'm glad you'll be here to wrap up at the end. Thank you.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to share an overview. I'm just trying to look for the screen now. I'm just going to share everything. Excuse all of my mess.
And good morning, everybody.
Good morning, Prof. Garrett. So applying the disciplines that we use to do the environmental scan and having a look at just the overall, what is the difference between King 5, and King 4 and King 4, King 4 and King 5. So just an overview, very high level, 3 principles, 1, 6, and 9, the ethical and effective leadership, acting as a focal point and custodian of corporate governance, and the evaluation and performance of the boards and its committees, really being pulled into a single principle around ethical and effective leadership and being a focal point in corporate governance, with the evaluation and performances becoming practices. 2 principles, ethical culture and corporate citizenship, really have been pulled into one as a single principle, ethical culture and corporate citizenship, with their practices essentially concatenated. The value creation process that was spoken about in King 4 is essentially the same, but spoken about as a sustainable value creation. Reporting, still the principal, composition of the board, the committee's delegation to management, and then we have a concatenation of 2 principles again in risk governance and compliance governance to risk and compliance. The IT information technology or technology and information is significantly different between the two. Technology and information in the first, and information and deployment through technologies is as the King 5. Remuneration, and I'll go into that in a little bit more detail, far more simplistic in King 5, with a lot of that directive coming through in the new Companies Act amendments now. Then assurance, and then stakeholder engagement. The one, of course, that was dropped off is this principle for responsible investing, which is really where aligned with CRISA, the Code for Responsible Investing in South Africa, and the UNPRI. I am a little sad to see responsible investment or responsible procurement in a broader sense not coming through. But hopefully that comes through in some of the practices, because that kind of investment also sees itself in procurement. Going through in details then, and I'm not expecting you to read all of this. These are the, this is what we will share with you. These are the principles in as written. A little bit of highlights I'd like to show. First of all, that the principles are written as statements now, as opposed to principles. So a principle being written with should, and a statement being as a fact. And this was debated to a lengthy process internationally when we were developing the ISO standard, and it's something to be taken note of, that a statement is interpreted more as a statement of fact, and it leads to compliance, versus a principle with a should, saying so the governing body leads, and then just turning that around, does the governing body lead, being a statement of fact. Whereas the should introduces more of a concept of, and how. If they should, how do they? So it's just a subtle nuance as one of the things, but it was a lengthy debate internationally. Then, of course, the reference to the triple context that we had in King 4 and the capitals, which have come from the integrated reporting side, have been reworded to talk about relationships and resources and relationships. And where there's reference to the triple context, it's actually spelled out being environment, social, and economic context within which the organization operates. So slightly different wording. The reds on the screen, you don't need to read it, of course, are where there are differences. And another thing that's come through is that there are several places where this steering and setting, essentially the 4 core activities that's come through King 4 is setting and steering and policy, setting strategy, steering through policy, oversight, and accountability through disclosure as being the 4 core activities, have been neatened up into principle 1 as a practice 2 there. Then perhaps just to mention at this point, the changes to the practices. So there are quite a few practices that don't find their way into King 5. For example, this protocol on how to obtain independent external professional advice, and how to then requisition documentation, or for board members to engage with management. And that does seem to be still required when you are looking at the SME and new startup companies. So that it seems to be there are gaps like that. But just to say that there seems to be a changes, not only in practices, but the approach to practices. And that's something that was also an international discussion, where certainly the approach to practices in King 4 was far more a recommended practices approach, to say, these are the principles. The principles are a requirement. In a compliance regime, it would be comply with the principles, but how you comply with those principles and what practices you choose are really up to you. And here is a list of recommended practices. Whereas the approach in King 5 seems to be far more required practices. Although they're called recommended practices, the approach seems to be far more driven on the basis of required practices. These are the practices that you should be implementing to apply the principles. Just to say, this is the 3rd principle that is brought into principle 1, and that is really around the self-evaluation. One point that came through was the principles, when they pulled together, seems to be more on the basis of appending the practices to the principles, as opposed to rethinking what the new principles and all of those practices intend to achieve. So there was a little bit of that was highlighted in the assessment. Another comment came through is that delegate to management comes through in King 4 often, and perhaps that concept is, and it comes through in King 5, but not as often. The concept to delegate to management perhaps should be incorporated in those 4 core activities, governing body activities, as we saw in Principle 1, recommended practice 2 of King 5. Yeah, that was the comment. Also to say, there are significant numbers of practices that aren't appearing as they were in King 4. For example, the practices on strategy. So there just needs to be alignment. Now, when King 4 first came out and King 3 was in play, there were also practices in King 3 that people found useful. Although then the statement came out with King 4 that actually King 4 takes precedent over everything. People did find a lot of practices in King 3 quite useful. So I think we might see the same thing happening with King 5. There's quite a lot more in King 5 around the use of committees and recommendations on the use of committees. For example, audit committees or risk committee, and specifically in technology and the IT information and technologies principle, there's a may delegate to a risk committee, for example. Sustainability reporting does come through, and it comes through as actually mentioned next to integrated and sustainability reports, and there is some of the sustainability reporting thinking coming through in some of the practices. And essentially, this is really showing there's quite a lot of red on the left-hand side and quite a few changes on the right-hand side as well. Principle 10 here, looking at appointment of management. There's quite a few practices here. And then Principle 11, we've got the concatenation of risk and compliance into the single principle. And you can see that running out how it comes through. And then, as I said, in IT governance, the information and technology, we've got a significant rewrite of how it's presented, talking about information governance, then talking about data. Sorry, I'm going the wrong way around. And anyway, so talking about information governance, talking about data governance, talking about within the context of information governance, talking about information technology in the context of information governance, and then a whole recommended practice on artificial intelligence, and which is something that was discussed at an international level as well, is raising the concern about emerging technologies, but perhaps, if you mention AI specifically, you are highlighting a risk where there are multiple other risks, and perhaps that could be disproportionate. So I just wanted to raise that the overview, applying the principles that we used for the environmental scan in the ISO work that we did, and certainly, and I'm going to launch a poll now. If you would like to participate in this with the Good Governance Academy, you'll be included in and then have your name included. You're welcome to say no. I'm just making sure that we've got everybody's names where we don't include you in the Good Governance Academy submission. But there's no attendance of meetings. We have until only the 4th of April. So, but if you would like to have exposure to what we're working on, please, I'm going to leave that up for a while. So thank you very much for listening to the overview. The King 4, the overview that, the IOD, the Institute of Directors of South Africa provided, is available in the webinar form. Please go and have a look at that. We're not trying to be the commenting on the creators. Obviously, the creators know their intentions. But I'd like to now perhaps move to Riani, because Riani, as CEO of the Compliance Institute of Southern Africa, there's quite a lot that I've said and mentioned around compliance, the should to the statements, the practices from recommended to perhaps an approach of required, and then bringing risk together with compliance. What is your sense of that from the Compliance Institute perspective?
I think there's often a sort of, call it a misconception about if we say compliance, it sort of brings a whole lot of thoughts and what it means. And what I have found over the years is to really crystallize what are we talking about if we say compliance. So is it compliance? And I like to use the 3 lines of defense model. I know it's a model that's been updated and now it's the 5 lines or whatever. It doesn't matter. The concepts and the principles are still sound. So if I can stick with the 3 lines of defense, so if we say about compliance by the first line, which is your operating area, the areas that give effect to the business, the products and services, etc., they have to comply with laws and regulations or those standards that they adopt. And that's your sort of first view on compliance. There, the control environment lives. They have to understand what is required, and then they have to comply. So if I say compliance in the sense of a King report, I would, sort of, yes, have you adopted it as an organization? You want to comply with it? Then I would say, yes, there's compliance to it. Of course, for listed companies, it is a compliance issue because they have to comply with the King report in South Africa. And then the 3rd line of defense is typically your internal audits and external auditors. So if they look at compliance, they would want to go and look at, was there compliance? Actual, an opinion about what is the level of compliance versus the internal auditors. That's more external audit kind of focus. Internal auditors would rather opine on the control environment, or they might also have had a brief to say, tell me what is my level of compliance. Now, if I look at the 2nd line of defense, that is typically where our compliance officers operate, and also the risk managers. So compliance and risk management, I think we just have to always be quite clear about what are we talking about. So if it's governance of risk and compliance, it does cut across all 3 lines of defense there. However, I would guard against what I've seen there in the King 5, is where they say that compliance should be integrated with the enterprise-wide risk management. I think one has to be careful with those kind of choice of words because they are 2 separate focus areas. And also, as I say, I think it's also quite important to understand that there are these different players in, if we say, risk and compliance.
Thanks, Riani. That's very helpful. And words do matter. And we have to choose the right words because interpretation, in this code, we don't have the report around it to give us that guidance. So that is also a missing part. You mentioned internal assurance and internal audit. I'd like to turn to Arlene now. Arlene is the CEO of the Institute of Internal Auditors in Southern Africa. So just from an internal audit function perspective, how do you think that internal audit functions can contribute to achieving the Principle 11? So Principle 11 has largely not changed between King 4 and King 5. Perhaps it has. And then how might the King 5 code influence the way internal audit is structured? It just as a first introduction into internal audit's perspective on King 5.
Thank you very much, Carolyn. And I think, it's a funny time for us because we are still at a stage where we are implementing, many of our internal audit functions are implementing the new global internal audit standards. So now I like the mapping that you did, King 4 versus King 5, and then we'll probably add another column there in terms of the global internal audit standards. But we definitely see a strong alignment between King 5 and the internal audit standards. I think that how we can contribute towards achieving the Principle 11, the assurance principle, is just in terms of internal audit playing a role in terms of the board's oversight role when it comes to risk management or risk governance. So also the ongoing controls evaluation, where internal audit needs to opine on the adequacy and the effectiveness of the control environment and give that feedback and assurance to the board. And then just regular reporting to the board. So looking at balanced reporting, I think what's coming through strongly in King 5 is that it's not only risk, but it also says expand on opportunities. So safeguarding against threats, but also capitalizing on opportunities. And that speaks to internal audit's growing responsibility, not only to provide assurance, but also to provide advisory services. And that's consistent where we see the profession moving as well. So I think there's a lot of synergy, even though the change is not significant. It's reinforcing where the internal audit profession is moving, and that's globally. And then in terms of the structure, so what I see in King 5 is that there's still, an appreciation that internal audit needs to be independently positioned within the organization. So obviously achieving its mandate and authority through the board, most times through an audit committee in terms of, what is its responsibilities, mandate, what's in the charter. But then also in terms of positioning so that it's independent of management. I see that coming through in King 5 in terms of the principles and the recommended practices. I don't think it's changed, but I think that it is there and it's important to retain. Just in what Riani said now with regards to risk and compliance and that convergence you spoke about, King 5 is still talking about combined assurance, and so internal audit still has a role to play when it comes to combined assurance. That differs across organizations, but it's consistent with our research where we see a blurring of the lines of defense. So I think risk and compliance merging. I think from an internal audit point of view, we still need to preserve our independence, but we also see a blurring of those lines of defense, which is quite interesting. It's an area that we've been researching. And then just in terms of the more pronounced role of internal audit. So I think that King 5 is really giving impetus to internal audit where we're not just playing in the financial and operational risk space anymore. We're starting to impact on strategy and ethical culture, which is the correct approach. So all in all, support for King 5 Principle 4. I think it's strengthening our internal audit functions. And I believe that was the intent, which is good. It's for the benefit of the organization as a whole.
I want to lean on your experience now, Arlene, as past president of ISACA South Africa chapter, so very much IT audit. What is your take on the IT, the change from the information, the different principles that we have across King 4 and King 5 from an IT auditor perspective?
I think that, what I've read in King 5 is that information governance is the overarching concept, and then IT, data or data governance, and emerging tech such as AI feeds into that. And I think that's consistent with, an IT auditor or an internal auditor's mandate where they need to give assurance to the board in terms of information. So I agree with information being at the top, because that then enables the board to do to really trust that information and do data-driven decision making. So I think that that the way it's positioned in King 5 is actually a positive move, and it's consistent with, when I left ISACA, we were grappling with digital trust and how the digital trust ecosystem fits together. And I think it's consistent with that thinking.
Thanks, Arlene. Now I'll turn to Elsevier, who's the chair of the technical committee at the Chartered Governance Institute of Southern Africa. Other people know them as the chartered secretaries or company secretaries, trusted advisors to the board. So really, chartered company secretaries have been called out, not only by Professor Garrett and his Carolyn Reid speech in the beginning, but there are some changes to the role of the COSEC in King 5. What is your take on it from a charter CGI perspective?
Yeah, so thanks, Carolyn. Just checking that you can hear me because I had some technical issues. Okay, fine. From our perspective, just looking at King 5, I think there was from the Institute's perspective, and you will know that of all the people on the call, probably King 5 or King 4 is the item that we use the most. So any changes has a significant impact. So there was a bit of a collective oh no when we heard that there was a King 5. I think having read and having looked at specifically the disclosure template, which is of importance, a lot to be supported. I saw some of the comments in the chat which indicated that there is a feeling that there's a bit of a watering down, and the proof will be in the pudding. I think we need to probably start from a principle that King 5 or any of the King reports will not avoid corporate scandals. There will always be corporate scandals because the question of ethics and how individuals apply ethics in the world today is something that we all grapple with from a corporate governance perspective. It's about what happens when no one's watching, right? So that's the important thing for us. Therefore, from the Institute, very supportive of the King 5 adjustment. I think having watched the Institute of Directors video and looking and specifically Ansi Ramalu's explanation about why they changed, understood. I think you've pointed out some of the practices that we lose specifically around strategy, which could be concerning. Which we will need to keep a watching brief on. But from an overall perspective, Carolyn, I think we must support the work that's being done. There's a few tinkering at the edges that we possibly can assist the Institute of Directors with, but overall, nice and friendly wording, easy to understand. It's reading much simpler and yeah, all in all, a nicer document to engage with. King 4 was a bit technical at times, so very, very much supported. And then there's also the plea, I think, is that where we have practices and they must be in support of principles, and if they're not applied, we must explain. And I think there is a tendency of various individuals across the country looking at corporate governance to have a bit of a tick box approach to those practices. And the intention is, and that's why the disclosure template is useful, because one can now actually tell the story about why you still believe that despite having not applied a specific practice, you still discharge the duty and the outcome by the principle, set by the principle. So I'll pause there, Carolyn, and then you can take it forward from there.
Yeah, but if I could just ask you another question. So one of the big, what we heard from Mervyn about the sustainability reporting being one of the reasons why we had to we're moving into a King 5. And certainly some of the languages comes through around sustainability, adding in the word sustainability reporting sometimes. But really, what is your sense? Because COSECs are going to be left with this problem as sustainability reporting is something that really needs to be driven as an implementation across the organization.
I think from a governance professional's perspective, anything that supports us in driving sustainability and that kind of thinking through the organizations is to be welcome. it's always about the practical application thereof, Carolyn, and that's where things are difficult. Prof. King spoke about the integrated way of thinking, and I think that's the difficult bit. And in some organizations, the larger organizations, it's more mature than in a smaller entity. So that's where I think the big struggle will be, is to ensure appropriate proportional application of the practices and the principles, so that you're not overburdening a small entity, but they still take away the items that's very, very important to ensure their sustainability across generations. So and that's the difficult bit of governance, right? Is to understand what is important, and that's where people don't spend enough time, is to actually sit down and think, what are the important things in this King 5 report that will make my business, if I don't do it, not be sustainable for the long term, because essentially you want to be sustainable, or I would hope that everybody would like to be sustainable.
Thanks, Elsie. I'm going to turn now to Owen. You mentioned, Elsie, you mentioned around the disclosure report, and that makes really the governance professionals' life a bit easier, having it spelled out. And certainly that is a kind of an aggregation of all of the disclosure practices that were sitting in King 4, not all of them, but a large portion of them. I'd like to turn now to Professor Skay. Owen is the Director of Rhodes Business School. Owen, from your perspective, how do you feel about the disclosure report being, or the disclosure template, really fitting in next to the code? It was practices before, and then perhaps what that behavior that's going to drive from a business practically perspective, from the committees to the delegation, etc. How do you see that working?
So, Carolyn, I think it's to be welcomed that there's the template, and I think it would enable comparability and consistency when it comes to reporting. My concern is the exception declaration. I think it could foster a tick box type of exercise. If we can just jump up to a higher level, though, I'm a great fan of King 4. Not that I'm not a great fan of King 5, and I think it's to be welcomed that there's a reduction in principles, but applying a sort of independent thinking. And as an academic, one must always adopt a critical view and be constructive about that. My students will always attest to the fact that I've taken the view that the King 4 code was unbalanced in terms of the coupling and linking to the 4 mindful outcomes. So I've never tested this empirically. I've never asked Professor King, for example, but my view, the two most important principles in the King 4 code are Principle 7 and Principle 10, that being the composition of the board, Principle 7, and Principle 10 being stay in your lane, the delegation of authority. So you get the board right, people do what they're supposed to do, then everything else should naturally follow, including the ethical culture. Now, to go to King 5, that's Principle 5 and Principle 7. However, with the changing of the terms, we've retained ethical culture as the first mindful outcome. The second, we've gone from good performance to performance, then the change from effective control to conformance, and then lastly, for legitimacy. If one kind of groups these principles around those mindful outcomes, the principle 5 and 7 under King 5, or principle 7 and 10 under King 4, for me, the orientation of the language is around control and conformance. And I go back to what Bob Garrett said right at the start. I believe that the board composition, the committees, and the delegation of authority is a performance issue. And I also think that it's proving to be hugely controversial around the world. If we take the resistance to DEI, we see what's happening in the United States. It's having profound implications. That is often driven by this perception that it's a compliance. The diversity of the board is not a compliance conformance issue. It's a performance issue. The other concern that I have has always been around the fact that the reporting part, which under King 5 will be Principle 4, and you have essentially one principle for legitimacy, which would have been Principle 16 and now Principle 12, to narrow your integrated reporting aligned to the purpose, creation of value statement narrows its focus. Your reporting is about your legitimacy. So you can't just have principle 12 that says go and actually engage with your stakeholders. The integrated report, as Professor King says, it's through the company to the stakeholders. It's the integrated report that confirms what your legitimacy actually means and what you stand for. And I think that would then neatly go into the ethical culture, which then creates this virtuous cycle. So I think that there needs to be a rethink around how these things are tied. Lastly, just Professor King made reference to Section 172 in the UK. What's interesting around reading that, if you read Andrew Haldane, for example, who owns a company, he makes the statement in there that hardwired into the UK Companies Act, the shareholder primacy. And often I think that directors don't spend enough time actually understanding the differences between different jurisdictions, because the better you understand what the UK does versus South Africa enables us to do it better here. So the fact that King 5 has reclaimed the inclusive stakeholder model, the fact that it's about acting in the best interest of the company, I think that can generate the performance that we're speaking about. Lastly, and I'm wrapping up now, Professor Archie Carroll, I did note that in the chat, people were saying, no, it's the ethical culture. We need to retain that. Absolutely. But ethical culture is not something that you can just make people have, right? I believe you can be trained in it. We need to spend more time doing that. And that's a function of your board composition, your committees, and your delegation of authority. But Professor Archie Carroll famously said that moral competence is as important as management competence. So we must never lose sight of that. And I don't think King 5 has in any way diminished that. That's still very important. The question is how one does it, of course.
Thanks, Owen. As really the only business representative here, and even from an academic perspective, because we're all really academics in our own rights here, but from a representing business schools and getting that, as Prof. Garrett's introduction said, the next gen directors. From the business school perspective, what are you seeing coming through, and what were they expecting to come through in the King 5? And do you see that it's come through?
Look, it's something that we are grappling with, and certainly you look at that series now on Netflix, Adolescence, it's quite terrifying actually, and the language of emojis and the generation. Mervyn King has always said we need to get younger people on boards, get them to sign a non-disclosure agreement. We've got to make this language all inclusive and all embracing. But at the same time, I think that one needs to recognize that governance is incredibly serious. It's complex. We need to maintain the qualitative governance. We need to make sure that it's not a tick box type of exercise. I think lastly around the risk part, I don't think that risk is a conformance issue. We need to make sure that risk and compliance is not seen to be conformance. I even go so far as to say that I think that King 5 needs to really think around whether conformance is the right word. And we've always grappled with the C words, compliance, control, conformance, comply or explain, comply. So the C word is a troublesome word. And I think that we need to get some more fundamental thinking around what that actually means.
Riani, would you like to comment on that? Thanks, Owen.
Yes, thank you. No, I couldn't agree more, Owen. I think for us as a compliance community, and speaking specifically compliance officers, this whole concept of, we're there to check that everybody's complying or conforming, as it were, is troublesome, because we follow a risk-based approach to compliance. So it's much more of a risk kind of focus on compliance. Yes, there are obviously those things in the laws and whatever that we have to comply with, but it's also understanding about how do I manage that risk. So do I have the right controls in place? Are my people trained? Are my policies up to date, etc. So the conformance thing puts us in a box, and people love to say this. It's like the tick box approach to compliance, and I want to die when I hear that, because it's really not what we're about. It's got to be much more risk-based and risk-focused. And so I would definitely agree with you there. And then my question when I hear the word conformance is conformance to what? So are you talking conformance to your internal policies, conformance to laws and regulations? What are we talking about? Because if it's internal, then it's a risk-based approach, and it's much more of a risk management approach than a conformance approach.
Thanks, Riani. Owen, would you like to respond?
Yeah, look, I tested it with my students the other day, and we run a hypothetical board meeting, and we came to the risk thing, and I said, how do you feel about it being a conformance issue? And the students are very troubled by that, So, I think, what are we conforming to? I think it stifles innovation, it stifles creativity, and I think that compliance officers are not the old cliche about being in a grey suit, whatever it is. It's much more than that, and therefore the qualitative governance, we can never compromise what that means, ensuring there's no tick box mentality. So I fully agree with what Riani said. But obviously, from a professional point of view, the professions also need to work on this too, to make sure that the right message is getting. Because ultimately, if King 5 is mandatory for listed companies, it's voluntary for everybody else. But you want to make sure that when the boards are making the decisions, they're being guided in the right way.
Speaking of which, perhaps let's bring Elsabe into this discussion. Elsabe, when what Owen was saying, when boards are making decisions that they're being guided in the right way, how much work have you been able to do as a technical committee in responding to the King 5 recommendations and principles?
Yeah, look, Carolyn, to answer your question directly, not much. The time for opinion and submission has been quite short from our perspective. And I guess it talks to the conversation we had before this meeting, which was around the, I don't want to call it lack of, but let's say less engagement than we had with King 4 on what was being changed to in the King 5 draft. There is still some time this year for them to have an engagement with all stakeholders, and let's see what happens. But it is a month in the world of a corporate and corporate secretary is not a lot of time. So we as I said, the initial sense that we got from a technical committee perspective is that it is something that we can support, but the devil is always in the detail, Carolyn. And one would like to just have some time to reflect on the detail, and the month that we were given was not enough time, I don't think.
Thanks. Thanks for that. Arlene, I wanted to ask about the people putting the company in straitjackets, or let's just call them the men in grey suits. But internal audit's often seen as a policeman looking for conformance. How do you respond to what Owen and Riani are saying?
Yes, I think we are in agreement with the spirit and the intent of King 5 in terms of, when conformance is mentioned. However, the word itself is problematic for us as well, because in our new global internal audit standards, it also refers to conformance and performance, and it means something different. So you said earlier, words matter, and I think that it could lead to misinterpretation. But I think that in terms of the intent of King 5 and the spirit and what it's trying to achieve in terms of the ethical cultures and outcome, in terms of the board's oversight responsibility for risk and compliance, oversight and governing that and directing that through policy, I think that all of that aligns with what we are seeing as where the internal audit profession is moving, the fact that we need to be more holistic in our approach, that we need to, I see Gary commented about having an inside view and an outside view. So interestingly, what's coming through in the global standards is this concept of public interest. If you look at our internal audit profession's purpose, it's about enhancing and protecting value inside the organization and serving public interest, which aligns to what is being said in King around Ubuntu and stakeholder inclusivity, etc. So there's a lot of alignment, but the word itself, conformance, that's where that's a little bit problematic. But it's definitely strengthening and supporting the role that we have to play as internal audit in terms of being holistic and not being seen as the policeman in grey suits.
And while you've got the mic, there's a question here from Leonie. It's alleged that King 5 is not only applicable to listed companies, but to all companies. So it's the same basis of King 4. You were involved as part of the drafting of King 5. Is that true? Is that it's got the same basis? It applies to all organizations, not only companies. Is that right?
Yes, I think that it is meant not to be information specific, and I mean I speak in the presence of Prof. Kings, but it's meant to be a universal code and universally applied, regardless of the size of the organization and the nature of the organization, or even the sector in which the organization operates. I think that is the intent of the code. Obviously, each organization needs to assess its own environment. The governing body of each organization needs to determine what's appropriate in terms of its context. But I think the code itself is meant to be universally applied across organizations.
Thanks, Arlene. A couple of questions from Linda here, and I'll stick with you, Arlene. She says, you have not referred to the AA 1000 assurance and accountability standards for directors. Should there not be alignment?
So yes, Carolyn, when I accepted, I said to you earlier that, we have a working committee together, and we are frantically working around the clock. As Alsabi said, it was a little bit, the comment period is not very, it's not a lot of time. So we do have a working group with subject matter experts, and we are working on mapping in the background so that we can submit comprehensive comments. And we will look forward to your slides as well so that we can incorporate your work into our working group. But it's still early days for us. We're still working through King 5, and we will definitely take all assurance standards into account. Thanks.
Thanks. Even the South African Bureau of Standards technical committee is only meeting this afternoon. So we've got the same issues, trying to get everyone, all the busy people around the table to have a discussion. I've got one for you, Riani, here, also from Linda. Do we still report on compliance through the GAI report? And will the template change? I don't know if you've had time to have a look at that.
I haven't actually. Yeah, so I'll reserve my comments, but I think maybe just a comment to make on our discussion just now. Around, sorry, I'm jumping back, but my mind is running. So just, the whole thing around conformance, I think that it suggests that, there's this standard, or there's this law, or there's this requirement that you have to conform to. When I think, and that's maybe a comment that I can make about King 5 at this point, what I was missing, although there is an outcomes-based shift towards outcomes-based or more prevalent, I think maybe it would help if one were to, in the principles, also highlight what were the specific outcomes for that principle. So, so instead of saying we have to conform to X, Y, Z, are we achieving the outcomes through our risk and compliance programs and activities in an organization?
Thanks, Riani. Yes, please.
Mr. Owen, what is intended by the word conformance, which I accept has various meanings in different contexts, is that the company has adhered to all applicable laws in which the company operates. So it's an adherence issue. To be a responsible corporate citizen, you've got to adhere to the laws applicable to that entity. And the word conformance, I understand the different meanings and understandings. But what about the word adherence?
And Prof. King, look, I think I'm not part of the King committee, but I think it's something to discuss, and maybe within the context of adherence to it can be, because I think King, you highlight should, must, may, and I think it's important. And in the glossary of terms, I was just interested to see that principle and practice is not defined. I'm coming back to you now in relation to adherence, because adherence can be you must, because that's the law. You're adhering to internal policies, and the board obviously has the oversight in terms of the SPOD acronym, strategy, policy, oversight, and disclosure. So I think that that may resonate better.
I would support as well.
And also,
Yes.
when you get to performance, the critical issue is value creation in a sustainable manner. So maybe also there you need some change in language. You need value creation in a sustainable manner, because that's really what you're trying to achieve as an outcome. And of course, considering preservation and erosion. But because we've got that change of mindset from just focusing on one stakeholder, namely the shareholder, to a value model, maybe that should be in the forefront of performance, is value creation in a sustainable manner.
And that cycles back to legitimacy, in my view. And I think if one looks at the glossary of King 5, for example, outcomes only refers to the 6 capitals outcomes. It doesn't refer to the outcomes of the King 5 code. So, I think that one needs to go through that glossary with a fine-tooth comb to be sure that the words mean what they're intended to mean. So that, again, there's no ambiguity around, we may have different versions of the truth when we come to making our decisions, but how we come to those decisions, there must be a single version of the truth. And one doesn't want directors debating these things. Did they mean that? Did they mean that? What does this mean? Because that then is compromising staying in your lane. And I think that that's a recipe for disaster.
Yeah.
And staying in your lane, talking about staying in your lane, and I'm obviously not, although I'm an IT professional, I'm not representing IT here, but it's certainly something that both King 4 and King 5 are quite detailed in almost, getting into the management levels of improving standards and frameworks and things like that, expecting the board to understand what all of these standards and frameworks, etc., entail and what the repercussions for them would be. So I think we need to do a little bit more work in terms of that staying in your lane in the practices that are sitting in the new principle on information and technology. But I know I'm coming to the end, and there's so many questions and there's so many I'd like to ask, but I'd first like to, before I ask Prof. Garrett to say, perhaps I can ask Prof. Garrett now to say a few words in terms of what you've heard and whether that has resonated with what you sent through to me to say.
Okay. Excuse me. And thanks for reading the paper as well. It was rather thrown together overnight. So, and by the way, can you hear me? Is my voice okay? Oh, fine. Okay. Well, first of all, congratulations on King 5. I mean, it is extraordinary that we've just seen the diversity of the debate, even within a relatively limited group of professionals here, let alone going into the wider world. Bringing that together into a coherent piece of writing is an amazing achievement in itself. And I still think you're world leading, and congratulations on that. Well done, South Africa, because it's a mess in most of the other parts of the world, and increasingly now it's just a horrendous mess in the US. Unbelievable what's happening in Delaware and elsewhere. So that's great. What's happened to me in the last 3 years is that I'd started thinking I'll most probably write one more book, and that'll be a sort of memoir of 40 years in corporate governance. Sadly, my dear wife, Sally, died unexpectedly 2 years ago, and that really threw me. But that got me into saying, no, I'm damn well going to write this book anyway. And it started me realizing that a lot of the people I've been speaking to, certainly in the last 20 years, retiring or have retired now. And even though many of them are still in quite senior positions in organizations, they're doing it as a sort of temporary job or a part-time job or whatever, thoroughly enjoying it. But I don't think they're very effective. And what was interesting to me when I started really interviewing people is they didn't think they were very effective either. But they had no idea what future corporate governance was going to be. So I then started talking to these people I've called in the paper the next gens, because I was getting more and more interest from younger people coming forward and saying, well, what's it all about then, Prof? Expecting a simple answer. And there isn't one. But their point was, we are not trained to do this work, and yet we are now taking over in organizations, anything from the age of about 35 through to about 60. And we still don't have any idea of what we're really meant to be doing. And I got this, I was very interested. That's why I came out with that E.O. Wilson quote from his book, The Social Conquest of the Earth, because they were effectively reflecting back to me, we've entered this century with Neolithic values, and my gosh, you see those at the moment, medieval institutions and godlike technology of which we are very frightened. And this seems to be destabilizing organizations around the world. But it's our organizations, profit or not for profit or whatever, which actually hold our world together. So they were genuinely worried about what to do. So one thing about King 5 immediately struck me was, and I think Mervyn has reflected it, is that I would have put performance culture up front now, because performance culture, purpose of the organization, and worked it from there, which is one of the reasons I added in my paper the 7 duties of director and the aspects of the purpose of a board, because I think that is absolutely the key to the whole thing. That is the practice. And how do you get commitment to it? Well, I've been doing work in the last 2 years now, quietly, with the Gulf Cooperation Council Board Development Institute, the 6 countries of the Gulf, and also at the other end of the scale in terms of wealth, the non-wealthy end of the scale, the 9 countries of the Caribbean. And finding there, the next generations are very interested in learning how to do this job properly, because they don't think it is being done well by either directors, legislators, or regulators. And it's interesting in talking with them to find that there's a genuine wish now to help save the world. I think it's got that serious now. And corporate governance is seen as one of the building blocks, sort of fundamental building blocks to saving the world. So it's becoming for them, at least, or some of them, very much a cause in its own right. And I think we're going to see a reframing of the idea of corporate governance as we go into this next generation. And within that, some things became fairly obvious to me, that more and more people are bailing out of the whole listed company framework. They're either not listing, or they're delisting, or they're trapped in minority shareholdings and that sort of thing, which don't help matters at all. I was quite surprised to find how many people, including in the UK, young people, are still willing to set up their own businesses or set up their own organizations and plow ahead with that. And they're beginning to realize they need training. But I was really shocked about 18 months ago with 2 things. One, I was asked to give a short talk, very short talk, in London, in the Houses of Parliament, to 100 MPs and members of the House of Lords. It was on advances in corporate governance. And so I did what I thought was quite reasonable to do for a very short talk, was just say how many people in the room can name, say, 3 of the 7 duties of director, how many people can give me any of the 6 aspects of the purpose of a board. Stony silence. Then 1 or 2 people were having a stab and mainly getting it wrong. So I refused to give the talk. Because I said, you are the legislators. You have passed these laws. It's very good law. And section 171, 172 are fundamental to corporate governance and persuasive of the law across the 56 countries of the Commonwealth. This meant it was a slightly tricky lunch. But it also, at the end of it, 6 of them came up and said, you're absolutely right. We are not trained in it. We all have firm opinions on everything that we thought we were going to talk about. And you pointed out that none of us have any factual base to it. We're not trained in it. And frankly, most of us don't care. So what I've been doing, but the other thing that happened then was I get requests, people passing through London. It happened that 5 of them from different countries, Mexico, Brazil, Indonesia, one of the Gulfs, people were passing through London, youngish people, next gen type people passing through London. So we decided we'd have a high tea at the Reform Club and just talk about things generally. And they all come from family offices, not family businesses, but family offices. So they all have their own investment wing to the range of family businesses of which they are joining the main board. They didn't know each other at all, and we had a very interesting guy, and they were very keen on section 171, 172. But at the end, I said to them, well, look, you're talking about affecting your investments in the future in what are not particularly rich countries. So what sort of size of investment are we talking about when we get into these areas? And they went away for a few minutes, talked to each other, came back, and they were quite shaken. And they said, over the next 10 years, we as young directors looking into a totally turbulent and unknown future, between us, the sum we think we will have to invest will be $6 trillion. And that's shaken us rigid. But it also means that we will almost certainly never go near a stock market. We will never, but we will need to really think through our social impact, our environmental impact, our accountability through the generation of our enterprise to really have effective corporate governance. And that's where I am at the moment, working with such people. It's interesting that, for example, in the Gulf and through the Saudis, a large sum of money is being invested in the professionalization of their directors and their company secretaries. A large sum, with formal registration now on the horizon. Very interesting indeed. At the other end of the scale, but I find happening a lot now is a simple notion that it's just wrong that people can pay in the UK £50, set up a company and be a director. That is just fundamentally flawed. It's just ridiculous. It's pathetic. So the idea of becoming a director is through having to spend a probationary period, say 6 months, with a board to even get a feel of what it's about. And then something I've done, but in very few organizations at the moment, is actually have each incoming new director swear an oath before the rest of the board and go through in detail each aspect of the 7 duties of director and the aspects of the purpose of the board. And they swear a personal oath to the board that that is what they will do. Now, some people think I'm absolutely nuts trying to do that, but it does not concentrate the mind, because that is what they're stepping up to do. And I think at that point, I'll click out.
Yeah, thank you, Prof. Garrett. That's words of wisdom, and certainly basics of learning is the ability to recall. That's why our children do the 2 times table and the they recite their tables, is ability to recall. But I'd like to now call on Prof. King. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time. Prof. King, can you close us with a call to action to corporate South Africa on the basis of the new King Code? What you want corporates to do differently today from what they've been doing in the past, or to continue doing? Thank you.
Right. I just want to say that I think South Africa has actually led the world in the question of corporate governance, because having chaired the United Nations on governance and oversight, I certainly learned a lot about the question of sustainability, etc., long before it was spoken about generally. And that's why, as early as 2002, we had sustainability as a listing requirement in our stock exchanges. And then the thinking of integrated thinking rather than the silo thinking that we had became very important when, with the degradation of the earth and the way society had in fact subsidized the profits of companies for 150 years. And that came out in the principle of integrated thinking and integrated reporting, which was 2016. So we have always been in the front. And it was interesting in 1992 when I was first approached to set up the committee which assumed my name, the King Committee. I had to come out with a report that would have been digestible to the majority of our fellow citizens. One couldn't come out with a report which was the dictate of the day of the primacy of the shareholder. Of course, in today's Bell Pottinger language, that would have been seen as white monopolistic capital. And so wittingly, I steered that committee away from that. And we came out with the King One essentially was you have to learn and understand the needs, interests, and expectations of your stakeholder groupings. But that's as a matter of fairness that you know about that. But always make a decision in the best long-term interest of the health of the company. And then there are going to be trade-offs between your stakeholders. But as a matter of fairness, you will explain to them why you made that decision. The next time you make a decision, it will benefit them more than the other stakeholder, etc. So in summary, I think King 5, there are things mentioned that I think need to be looked at. I mean, the King Committee is in a consultation period about this. And I think today has been very useful, Karen. It would be very useful, in fact, if we could summarize some of the points and chat to Palmy and Ansi about them. So who's going to do that?
Yes, the Good Governance Academy will be doing that, Prof. Thank you very much, Prof, for finishing us off. Thanks, Prof. Garrett, for joining us. And lovely to have you on board, give us a business perspective. Riani had to drop off, unfortunately. Elsaby, thank you so much for bringing the corporate secretary governance professional perspective to it. Arlene, thank you for giving us the assurance view and of course the difficulty in aligning with your own professional standards. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us on this call, and we are looking forward to engaging you further to consolidate our comments to go back to Palmy and Ansi. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Kerry, for setting it up.
Thank you.